that we talk about being here in New Orleans, the importance that we like ascribe to this neighborhood, to this area, we don't see any of that here anymore due to the gentrification of the city that's been.
The first question is, what is the first thing that comes to your mind when you think of the Treme neighborhood?
The first thing that comes to mind when I think of the Treme neighborhood is, well, the first thing I'll say is history. The second thing I'll say is like an authentic look into the accomplishments of people of color in New Orleans and across the South in general, with the Treme being like one of the first established Black neighborhoods in like not just New Orleans, but like the country. It's such a hugely important place. It's like the birthplace of jazz music. It's the birthplace of so many interracial, interfaith, intercultural exchanges that really make New Orleans what it is today. But in terms of that, it's also really sad because if you walk through this neighborhood today, you won't really see that. The history that we talk about being here in New Orleans, the importance that we like ascribe to this neighborhood, to this area, we don't see any of that here anymore due to the gentrification of the city that's been really unfolding for several decades now, but we've seen an even stronger push that's given us more gentrification since Hurricane Katrina, and even more so ever since.
I guess for you to experience that change kind of leads into one of my other questions is can you remember yourself a time before the gentrification was this rampant in the Treme?
Well, I'll say, because I'm from Uptown, so I'm not originally from the Treme. I'm from the Irish Channel Garden District area. It's a different neighborhood. It's a different part of town, and so I can't really speak to like that authentic experience of growing up in the Treme. But I will say, even with being from Uptown, which has had a history of money, it has had a history of being mixed. I will say that the entire energy, the culture, the feel, the population is incredibly different. You go from growing up in a place where you see people who look like you, who understand you and your culture. I'm someone who is Creole. I did grow up with a little bit of my language, with a little bit of Kurivini, with a lot of aspects of that culture being a huge part of my life and how I was raised in my thought process and how I view the world and how I view the afterlife and all these other existential questions that are engaged with that culture, because it's mine and it's what I grew up with, and I grew up around other people who had it. Being fairly young when Hurricane Katrina happened, which is really when we started to have to face that change. I think it's a misconception that like Hurricane Katrina happened and then suddenly everything magically went downhill. Like there were little rumblings and little things there prior to, but Hurricane Katrina sort of put us in this spot where we couldn't really deny those things. We couldn't really deny people being pushed out of their homes. We couldn't really deny the increase of prices. We couldn't deny that anymore. That our schools were being taken over by businesses. That instead of having a very balanced private or Catholic school and public school system, also a lot of the inequality here I was actually talking with my coworker Brooklyn about what it was like being displaced. It made me so aware, and she shared the same sentiments with me in Texas. It made her, both myself and a lot of other people, so aware of how unique New Orleans culture was, down to like our language, because a lot of us like we call it yat, which is like our New Orleans like colloquialisms and our little words and things that we say, and it's so entrenched in the way that we talk and what we do and say, that like we don't notice that other people don't speak that way and don't express themselves that way and often have no clue what on earth we're saying, which, you know, people throwing the word refugee around a lot to people who evacuated from Hurricane Katrina, which is traditionally, refugee has like such a negative connotation. Um, like people very rarely use it to speak of someone positively, but it's also like someone who evacuates for a hurricane is usually not, that's not what a refugee is supposed to be, but it puts you in this very weird space of like the negativity with that and how people negatively viewed New Orleanians and a lot of the stigmas that came from being it. It's a really strange feeling, especially coming back after Hurricane Katrina and even as things got more gentrified, to go from being in a place where you saw a lot of people who looked like you, who understood culturally how to act in a place, how to speak in a place, what was going on, to suddenly be home and it not feel like home. Like you don't see people who look like you anymore. Like neighborhoods are becoming, you know, less diverse. You're seeing more businesses that really are not opened by people who are from here and not really for the people who are from here. Like it's it's a really strange feeling where home doesn't really feel like home anymore. Um, I I believe that there truly is an overly romanticized view of what New Orleans is, and I think any place that's like a touristy place has that. But there is something to saying that like the feel of the city is different. That music, that magic, it just feels off. It feels different. It feels weird, you know, seeing such a strange place where people don't react the same. Like we have what's called like speaking. Like if you see someone on the street, you speak. So like you talk to them. And New Orleans culture is very friendly. It's very, you know, like you can go to make, well, other people say buying groceries, we say make groceries, at a store and end up talking with a stranger for like 20 minutes. You know, that's a very common occurrence in New Orleans. And that's sort of gone. Like, you know, the ways that you would just subtly greet people, like walking down the street, like a lot of that's gone. And it's like you can tell, even in like such a subtle thing, you can tell who's from here and who's not from here. And I don't know, it's a little bit isolating because you're like, where are like my people at? And it's strange when you see important historical places really get torn down and torn into overpriced apartments and not really valued, and people fighting over land, and you have all these beautiful Creole cottages and shotgun homes that are historic, and someone bought a property in between that and like decided to make like a shipping container house or like a weirdly modern place that doesn't go with anything. And it's like you can tell who's buying the property and who's living there, and based on like the changes you see in the architecture.
So you would say like gentrification has made like or has taken away kind of like the community based like collective part of culture.
I think that people still crave community here, and I think that community members still come together. Like it's that's really just Louisiana culture, is like community. Like that's why we have the Cajun Navy. That's why we have, you know, even during COVID, people coming together. Like you'll have a random person who'll get together with a couple of friends and be like, okay, this natural disaster just happened. We're gonna go and buy a bunch of food, pull our money together, and serve our community food. Like they're not with the Red Cross, they're not with, you know, whatever organization. These are just people coming together, making sure their community is fine. And trying to do the best that they can do. People who will be like, hey, even if you don't know me, I have power at my place. I'm like one of the few places with power in this area right now. You can come here and charge your phone. You can come here and charge your laptop. Like that sort of thing. I think that we still have that. But one of the things that I think is increasingly becoming a problem, even in the nonprofit area, as we see more nonprofits and organizations pop up, is people who have a lot of really great intentions and they see that there are people in need and they don't really understand what those needs are and they don't really want to know. They just know what they want to contribute to feel great about themselves, feel like they've made a difference, but not necessarily what those needs are. And it's really hard to have a community group to help a community without the voices from that community involved.
And that kind of ties into your work with Anna's Place, with like the youth that do grow up and live, especially in the Treme, but now all over New Orleans. Um, is how do you think you specifically have been impacted by the gentrification in this area, and like why does Anna's Place specifically, you know, how does Anna's Place kind of fit into that, them having to deal with the gentrification?
So the gentrification impacts us on several levels, but the first one is we spend over $30,000 a year on transportation for our students. So when this program first started out, many of these kids were like in the neighborhood, they lived here. Some of them still do, um, but a lot of them no longer afford to live in this neighborhood. And a very common thing with people living in poverty is sometimes you have to move around a lot. Sometimes you cannot um, make your payments anymore, which is not a moral judgment against anybody. There's so many things that happen. And also, being low income, you end up with slumlords who do not do things morally or ethically, and you end up having to move. Legally, you can't just raise someone's rent out of nowhere in the middle of their lease. But if you have a slumlord and you're barely able to survive, generally you can't afford a lawyer, you can't afford, you know, deal with all like that's you're not at liberty to do that. So there's so many factors in it, but it's a very common thing for people who end up having to a move around a lot, b change their phone numbers a lot. There's also some people who have to do month-to-month leases, and sometimes there's a month that's simply not great for you. So not being able to afford rent. So a lot of kids have been displaced throughout various parts of the city. So we pick up here for the morning, and we bring them home at night. Um, One of the reasons why we do that is because it's noticed that kids need consistency, they need stability, and unfortunately, like, there's so many studies that support that children simply just need stability to have healthy lives and to even have a chance. And you know, you can't control what their parents do or where their parents are going to end up going to, or you know, if they're going to be living with their biological parents or living with a grandparent. No matter where you move to in this city, have this place to come back to where you know you're going to get a meal. You're going to get like a hot, healthy meal. You're going to have someone who's going to help you with your homework. You're going to have someone who listens, and you're going to have someone who's invested in your future. It's not to say that all of these kids have invested in their future, that all of them don't have parents who can provide to them. It's not to say that. It's just that we are ensuring consistency when they are here. Like that is what we can give to them. And part of my job is ensuring that we get the funding to maintain that. I don't work as much with the youth one on one, but my job is as development director to ensure we have the funding to keep this program going so that we can keep doing that. And that's also where gentrification comes into play, is because um, as prices went up and there's far more wealthy people living in this neighborhood, there are far more people who have the capacity to give to this program to keep it open. However, because a lot of people are not from here, they don't necessarily know we exist, they don't know these kids, they moved here for whatever reason, they're not as invested. And there's some people who are. There are a lot of people who are invested. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. This was great.
Yeah, thank
Thank
you,
you so
Liz.
much.